Okay. So we're going to continue book 1. And book 2 of the Republic. We're going to focus primarily on book 2 today with a brief recap of book 1. Toward that end, let's recap book 1 real quick. Let's look at our characters, see what's going on, and try to make sense of it. So, if you recall from book 1, our central question here is, what is justice? Or, as I've been calling it, dikaiosune. This is the original Greek. Or, like I said last time, the reason I'm going to call it dikaiosune and not justice.
You need to cross the T on the left.
The reason I'm going to call it dikaiosune and not justice is because dikaiosune is more encompassing than justice. When we think about justice, we think about the allocation of duties and burdens. However, in the Greek mind, dikaiosune has so much more to do than the distribution of goods and burdens. Rather, dikaiosune has to do with moral goodness. It has to do with what it is to be good at things. So for that reason, I'll continue to use the Greek here, dikaiosune, as opposed to the English justice. Recall from last time, we said that the structure of book 1 is an early period book. As such, it takes the format of the elenchus, which this methodology of the elenchus is a back and forth dialogue between Socrates, who's serving as the mouthpiece for Plato, and his interlocutors. And we never, in early period Platonic dialogues, we never actually get a definition, or very rarely, we do it in the late cases. Very rarely do we actually get a definition of our target. Rather, we come to what is usually we come to an aporia. Aporia derives from the Greek word poros, which is where we get our word pore, like on your skin. Poros is a passageway, plus what's called an alpha privative. Alpha privatives are like in English un or in. So unintelligent is how we negate the adjective intelligent. Incapable is how we negate the adjective capable. In Greek, the alpha privatives are the same format. So aporos is an impasse, quite literally an impasse. It is where the dialogue can go no further, and usually everyone just goes home at that point. So book 1 takes this format. It takes the methodology of the elenchus, and it ends to a degree in an aporia. It ends at an impasse where Thrasymachus proposes a definition that Socrates successfully reduces, if you recall from last time, to a reductio ad absurdum, an RAA, thus showing Thrasymachus that his definition of dikaiosune cannot possibly be true. Now, were this an early period dialogue in its totality as a work, then we would end there. But as a mid-period dialogue, it pushes further. And this is where book 2 picks up. So book 2, and this is going to be the case for books 2 through 10, our central characters are going to be that of Socrates. Socrates is by far the main character. He is Plato's mouthpiece in early and mid-period Platonic dialogues. We're going to have Glaucon. And then we're going to have Adeimantus. We will hear from time to time from Thrasymachus. But Thrasymachus drops out at this point as a main interlocutor. Rather, I would pose to you the structure of books 2 through 10 is a sophistic debate at times between the character of Socrates and the character of Thrasymachus. And they are arguing over, they're trying to convince both Glaucon and Adeimantus. So Glaucon and Adeimantus are what is at stake in the argument. They're who the argument is over. They're trying to win over of Glaucon and Adeimantus. Now, Socrates, in many of his dialogues, is very clear to state he has no interest in sophistry. Sophistry is the practice of teaching people how to argue for the sake of argument so that they can be effective in public discourse. Think of it like speech and debate. It's the practice of rhetoric. Socrates has no interest in sophistry. Rather, Socrates is fully interested in philosophy. He's interested in finding the right answer, not necessarily in winning. However, Thrasymachus, by contrast, so Socrates here is interested in the practice of philosophy, which is the pursuit of wisdom, what is right or what is true, whereas Thrasymachus is interested in the practice of sophistry. And this is a bit of cultural insight into 3rd century Hellenic society, particularly 3rd century Athenian society. In 3rd century Athens, there was this group of individuals called the Sophists. Plato has a dialogue called the Sophists. It is a late period dialogue. But the Sophists were a group of for-hire teachers that purported to be able to teach public success. They purported to be able to teach their students how to speak and engage people publicly so as with the end goal of the student achieving some kind of public acclaim. So they would teach students the art of rhetoric. That is, the art of public speaking with the goal of influencing people. Now, Plato and Socrates are consistently opposed to the Sophists. So Sophists are opposed to Plato and Aristotle, Plato and Socrates. Socrates and Plato, they purport to be interested in finding the right answer. Now, there is a genuine question here about the degree to which Plato and Socrates engage in sophistic tactics in order to find out what the right answer is. But at face value, at undergraduate level, what we can say is that the Sophists are engaged in rhetoric, they engage in the art of winning a debate, regardless of whether or not one genuinely believes the position, whereas Plato and Socrates are engaged in the art of finding out what is true. And as I said last time, Socrates and Plato genuinely think that the method by which we can uncover what is true is this method of the elenchus. Okay. So that's a bit about methodology there, just an overview of what's going on, kind of the background information here. But now let's provide a brief recap of book 1 and then start to dive into book 2. So book 1, by the end of book 1, we receive a series of definitions for dikaiosune. Okay, we get 2 definitions by Cephalus, and both of of these definitions are excluded. Why? Because they fail to answer the central question, TSD. What is it? They fail to provide an account of what X is, or what dikaiosune is. Rather, they provide examples of dikaiosune. And then we get a series of definitions by Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is clearly a much more clever interlocutor than Cephalus is. So much so that Thrasymachus, we know historically, Thrasymachus was a real person. Thrasymachus was a sophist. He was one of these people charging wealthy Athenians, purporting to be able to make their children successful in the public sphere. Okay. And by the end, the central definition that Thrasymachus proposes for dikaiosune is that dikaiosune is the advantage of the stronger. So this is the definition and variations upon which we have to contend with for the entirety of Book 1. That dikaiosune is the advantage of the stronger. Now, I encourage you to reread Book 1, see the individual steps, but the end of Book 1 is going to attempt to reject dikaiosune based on the grounds, or based on analogy. It's going to try to reject dikaiosune as the advantage of the stronger by looking at other crafts and seeing what those crafts are aimed toward. So, we get an analogy here between horse breeding, dog training, shepherding, and dikaiosune. Thrasymachus proposes that dikaiosune is the advantage of the stronger. As such, Thrasymachus perceives dikaiosune as being centered or being focused on the legislator, being focused on the individual. But Socrates wants to try to show us that, look, dikaiosune is not focused on the individual, rather it is focused on the external, it is focused on those around the legislator. And he gives us the analogy of horse breeding, dog training, and shepherding. Now, horse breeding, the end here, or the thing that we are invested in, is the horse. Dog training, the thing that's invested in is the dog. And then shepherding, the thing that is invested in is the sheep. In none of these instances is the thing that is focused on the owner. Now, Thrasymachus is going to say, yeah, sure, to some degree we are focused on the horse, the dog, and the sheep. But the reason that we focus on all three of those in the individual crafts is because it benefits the owner. A horse breeder wants to raise strong horses or fast horses because it benefits her. This is how she makes her money. A dog trainer wants to raise obedient and purposeful dogs because this is how she makes her money. A shepherd wants to raise fluffy and fat sheep because this is how she makes her money. So Thrasymachus tries to take this analogy and show Socrates rather forcefully that no, the focus is still on the owner. But what Socrates is going to do here is to attempt to show us that dikaiosune, by focusing on, in this case, I'm just going to use the Greek phrase here, the hoi polloi, or we may think of as the common people, the commoners. There's a common phrase in Greek, the hoi polloi, the masses. By focusing on the benefit of the hoi polloi, we are then able to benefit the individual. So a good legislator benefits herself by focusing on the commoners, by focusing on those over whom she has authority. And this is the end role of dikaiosune. So dikaiosune is still, like these other crafts, is still other focused. It is not inherently or intrinsically focused on oneself. And while that sounds nice, Glaucon and Adeimantus are going to pick up the bulk of the conversation in Book 2. And in Book 2, we're going to get a question here. So the question we get in Book 2 is dikaiosune intrinsically or extrinsically valuable? It's our focal question. Is dikaiosune intrinsically or extrinsically valuable? Brief recap of the phrase or the terminology here. What it is for something to be intrinsically valuable is for it to be desired for its own sake, not for what it can get you. So if you recall Aristotle says that the chief good, whatever that may be, must be intrinsically valuable. And then we learned that daimonia, as the chief good, is intrinsically valuable. What it is to be extrinsically valuable, by contrast, is to be valued for what you can do, you can use it for. So money is your characteristic extrinsic good, because the reason that we desire money is not for its own sake, hopefully. If so, you're just like Smaug the dragon. The reason we desire money is because of what it can get us. If money loses its purchasing power, money loses its value. Okay? So the question we're trying to figure out here in Book 2 is, look, why be just? Why be dikaios? Is it valuable in and of itself? Or do we only value it because of what we can get from it? As you could imagine, Thrasymachus he takes the position that if one is going to waste one time being just, once again, remember he's opposed to all this. He says, look, just be strong. Just be the strongest. Do what you want. He very much has this like absolute monarch, this fondness of the absolute monarch, almost of a dictator. So Thrasymachus, he says, if it is valuable, it has to be valued extrinsically. That is, if dikaiosune is valuable, which he's already skeptical of, it is only valuable in virtue of what it can get you. Socrates, by contrast, is going to maintain that dikaiosune is intrinsically valuable. That is, it is desired for its own sake. And then our last two interlocutors, I'm going to lump them together because they're rather interchangeable. That of Glaucon and Adeimantus. These two guys are undecided. Look at the relationship here. Thrasymachus and Socrates hold opposing views. Glaucon and Adeimantus, as the two who are influenceable, are undecided. So in many ways, Glaucon and Adeimantus are being swayed by Socrates and Thrasymachus. Okay, there's this kind of tug of war going on throughout the entirety of the Republic over the suke, the mind, sukai, this is plural, the minds of Glaucon and Adeimantus. And Socrates, in the end, is going to try to demonstrate to Glaucon and Adeimantus that justice is of intrinsic value. It is valuable for its own sake. Now, this is a really hard line that Socrates has to push. Okay? Socrates is going to be faced with, by Glaucon and Adeimantus, with what is with a thought experiment. Now, thought experiments are common practice in philosophy, and they mimic the nature of scientific experiments. The same way in scientific experiments, you have a hypothesis, and you are testing for a particular variable. A good scientific experiment tests for only one variable. So too with a thought experiment. The only difference between a thought experiment and a scientific experiment is you do not gather empirical data necessarily in thought experiments. There are kinds of thought experiments where empirical data is gathered, or we may even think about gathering census data as empirical data, but that's beside the point. And the thought experiment that Socrates is posed with is called the Ring of Gyges. The Ring of Gyges. So I'll tell you the backstory, kind of set the plot of the Ring of Gyges, and we'll see how Socrates deals with this. So the Ring of Gyges, the story is that there is a shepherd of the king, of the Lydian king, and the shepherd, after a great storm, finds a grave that has been split open. Inside the grave is a skeleton of a person greater than your average man, that is larger than your average man. And the only thing that the skeleton has on him is a golden ring. Okay? Now, the farmer then takes the ring, and at the next meeting of the king's shepherds, where the shepherds have to recount to the king or to the king's attendant the status of the flock, the shepherd gets bored. He gets bored, he starts fiddling with the ring, and the ring has a raised portion, and he turns it toward himself. Okay, so imagine a ring that has something you can fiddle with on it. Okay, and he turns the signet of the ring, and he goes invisible. He then turns it back, and he becomes visible. Okay, and for some reason, this is kind of glossed over very quickly by Plato. When the farmer is when the shepherd is invisible, he is treated by his peers as if he were not there. And when he's visible, he's treated by his peers as if he were there. For some reason, the peers don't seem to be picking up on the guy blinking in and out of visibility. But ignore that, neither here nor there. Gyges, the shepherd picks up on this, and he decides to go invisible. So he turns the ring, he seduces the queen, wins her over, and then with the help of the queen, he murders the king and disposes of him. Okay? Thus taking over the king's kingdom. And Socrates is then posed with this question of, look, the only reason the farmer, or the shepherd, did not do this naturally, or did not do this, is because he knows he would be caught. Right? The only reason farmers don't try to overthrow kings is because they know they'll be caught, or they know that they'll be subject to public shame, what have you. There's some outward-facing repercussions, whatever those repercussions may be. However, were farmers, or were the shepherd given this ring of Gyges, then this is what they would do. They would overthrow the king. They would seduce the queen and overthrow the king. And the question we are supposed to ask ourselves here is that really the only reason that we do just things? Is the only reason we do good things is because we are afraid of the public scrutiny. Is the only reason we do good things is because of the repercussions that we would face publicly were we to do unjust things. Thrasymachus says, yeah. And so much so that this is even the common opinion, Glaucon and Adeimantus note. They note that, like, look, Socrates, most people, they seem to think that the only reason to be just is because if you're not, you're going to pay for it publicly. So much so that centuries later, the Hellenistic thinker Epicurus, he's going to hold this same exact view. He's going to say that justice is not intrinsically valuable. Justice has only extrinsic value, because if you're not just, your life gets horrible. Simple as that. But Socrates is going to take this really hard line and say that no, even if you have the ring of Gyges, you still ought to do what is just. You still ought to, I guess in the shepherd's case, keep shepherding the flock. You don't go seducing the queen and overthrowing the kingdom. Why? Because dikaiosune is not limited, or it is not measured by the public sphere. Glaucon and Adeimantus are skeptical. They want to believe Socrates. They really do. Glaucon is very clear about this. He's upfront about this. He's like, look, Socrates, I want to believe you. And he's like, and I do believe you, but I don't know why. I don't have reasons to believe you. Thrasymachus is like, this is just utter nonsense. Okay? And we're trying to figure out, if justice is intrinsically valuable, then why? And what Socrates is going to propose here is a change in the methodology. He's going to propose, so we're trying to figure out at this point the location of dikaiosune in the human. And what Socrates proposes is to say, look, let's blow up the scale. Okay? Instead of trying to find dikaiosune in the human, let's find dikaiosune in the polis. That is, in the city. Because the human being smaller than, this is a 90-degree turned lesser than sign, because the human is smaller than the polis, it is harder to locate dikaiosune in the human. But the polis, and this is important for the Greek mind, the polis, or the city, we would just translate as a city, is not a collection of buildings. Rather, what constitutes the polis are the people. The buildings, the built landscape has nothing to do with the polis. The polis has everything to do with the people. So because the polis is a conglomeration or an aggregation of people, it is easier, so proposes Socrates, to find dikaiosune in the polis instead of trying to locate it in the human being or in the individual. But once we locate dikaiosune in the polis, we can then extrapolate and locate it in the human being. Okay. So in order to do this, we start doing the Sims. If you ever played the computer game from the early 2000s of The Sims, you build a city. And this is exactly what Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus do. They begin by building a city, one at least in concept. And we start to see the city progress. We start with what is commonly called the city of swine. It moves to the luxurious city. And then the end goal here is really the Kallipolis. That is the noble or the beautiful city. Now let's start with the city of swine. Socrates does not call it the city of swine. This is just what it commonly gets referred to as. What Socrates first does when he's doing this thought-building process of building the noble city, or building a city, is think, look, what are human basic needs? What are the basic needs that humans have? We need food, we need water, we need shelter. We need then the tools that are necessary to produce food, water, and shelter. That's about it. So we start with this city, and Socrates is very much a proponent of specialization as opposed to being a jack of all trades. Because the idea here is when you specialize in something, you are more efficient at it, and you are better at doing that one thing. Here's a real world example. Both a general contractor and an electrician can do basic electrical work in your house. But the electrician is going to be better at it than the general contractor. The electrician is going to be more efficient and more skilled at solving the problem. Why? Because the electrician specializes in electrical problems. Whereas the general contractor, as a jack of all trades, knows about basic electrical matters, but this is not what she specializes in. And because she lacks this expertise, this specialization, even if she can figure it out, she won't be as good at it as the electrician. The benefit of the general contractor is they know what you need and who to go get to fix what you need. Okay? Whereas the homeowner, you may not know what you need. The general contractor knows what you need. A good general contractor, I have a general contractor for my house. And he's an excellent guy. He's a good friend of mine. What makes him so good is not what he can do with his hands, is his network. What makes him so good is that he can get me the specialists that we need to fix the problem. Okay, so Socrates is going to advocate for specialization. So in our city of swine, you're going to have a farmer, you're going to have a cobbler, that is a guy who makes shoes, you're going to have a house builder, you're going to have these people that their job is to meet the basic needs of the society. Okay, that's their only job. They meet the basic needs. Socrates says here in the city of swine that, people, they do subsistence level agriculture, they have their romantic partners, but only have kids that they can support. They don't go beyond that. Okay? Because the city of swine is focused on survival. It's focused on subsistence. And this is a great question here for Socrates, but it really seems like Socrates, he doesn't say it, but it really seems like he lauds the city of swine as kind of what we should be aspiring toward. This just subsistence level, make use of, or get what you need and don't go beyond your means. He seems to really laud this as the pinnacle. But Glaucon and Adeimantus, they say in not quite these words, like, Socrates, this city sucks. Why does it suck? And the things they bring up are hilarious. They say, there's no relishes. There's no luxury. There's no figs. There's no cheese. There's no good dining couches. Rather, we're sitting on reed beds or leaf beds. There's no nice things. And Socrates, because people like nice things, says the city must grow. Because now we need to have people who their job is to make nice things. Whereas before we just had the person who was farming for wheat and barley, now we need the person who knows how to make cheese. But if you know how to make cheese, that means you need sheep. Greek society, not Western European, so not less cows, more sheep. Because we want cheese, we need sheep. Well, if we need sheep, we need shepherds. And you see how the city begins to grow. In order to meet the desires of the people, you need more and more specialists doing these things. And Socrates says, well, if you want cheese, you're probably going to want meat. That means we need cattle. That means we need cattlemen. If we need cattlemen, that means we need more doctors. Why? Because the more red meat you eat, even Socrates knew this, cholesterol is eventually going to get to you. And the more luxury you have in your diet, the more of a doctor you're going to need. So with the development, as we move up the level of luxury, we're starting to grow the city. And then Socrates says, well, look, eventually you're going to run out of space. Because once you start having all these things, you need the space to put them all. You need the space for your cattle, you need the space for your house, you need the space for your fig orchards, etc., etc. But when you run out of space, how do you get more space? Well, you got to take it from your neighbor. Because space is finite. And then Socrates says, look, we just found the origin of war. War is founded, the reason we engage in warfare as a species is because we want luxury. We want stuff. And when we run out of space to hold our stuff, we got to go take the neighbor's space for the stuff. Or when we can't make something, we got to go take the neighbor's. So a project you could do for sure is look at the wars throughout history, be they US wars or foreign wars, and see to what degree is Socrates right. Socrates here really sums up the Roman Empire, Roman expansion. Okay, he's living well before the Roman Empire, 300 years minimum before the Roman Empire, but he sums up Roman expansion. The reason the Romans expanded to conquer all of Europe and most of Asia is because they needed more space. This is what set the Roman Empire up for failure, is their economic model was founded upon giving land to veterans, but you got to have the land to give it. You served 20 years in the Roman military, you received a plot of land free of charge. Well, in order to keep doing that, especially when your military gets really good and the guys stop dying as frequently, you got to have land to give. Eventually, you run out of Italy and you got to go keep getting land. This is what caused the Roman expansion. This is a reason why the Romans expanded, was because they needed more land to give to veterans. Okay? So in many ways, Socrates is onto something here. But if we're going to have a luxurious city and we're going to have war, we need soldiers, or what Socrates calls guardians. This is going to be a key word, so hold on to this. We're going to need guardians. And because these guys are responsible for the well-being, so they're responsible for not only securing the city, but also for getting more stuff for the city, they're really important. And we got to make sure we do these guys well. So now in books 3 through 5, what we're going to get is a discussion of the education of the guardians. And Socrates is the last thing I'll mention today. Socrates is going to ground the education of the guardians in two things you may not think. Music, and I'm going to keep it quite literal, gymnastics. Now when I say gymnastics, I don't mean Simone Biles. I just mean PE, physical education. Okay? Music and gymnastics are the core, the foundation of the education for the guardians. Because for Socrates, and we'll talk about this in relationships with the Hellenic mind, gymnastics cultivates the body, music cultivates the psyche. Okay? And because of this, the kinds of music and gymnastic experiences that the guardians are going to be subjected to is heavily controlled, because of the importance of their role in the polis. So we're already starting to see this question come more to the forefront. What is the role of force in the proper management of the polis? And is force ever politically justified? Socrates is going to paint a really scary picture of this. Okay? And it's a question we need to keep thinking about throughout the entirety of the text. But we'll go ahead and end there.